Hello and welcome to another edition of WION Live Broadcast. I'm Nick Harper from Washington DC, and let's start with the top headlines of the day. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov meets Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Delhi and praises India for taking a balanced stance on the Ukraine issue. French President Emmanuel Macron launches a bitter attack against far-right leader Marine Le Pen after warning supporters to take nothing for granted in an increasingly tight French election. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán says Russian gas exports are needed for the functioning of the Hungarian economy, as he opposes sanctions on Russian energy. Israel and the United Arab Emirates have agreed on the terms of a free trade agreement to boost commercial relations following their normalizations of ties. And the United States jobs market reflects a robust rebound in its latest figures from last month. America added over 400,000 jobs and registered a drop in the unemployment rate. Well, with just 9 days to go for the first round of the French presidential polls, all candidates are ramping up measures to get to the country's top spot. Incumbent President Emmanuel Macron continues to remain the favourite, with far-right candidate Le Pen inching closer to securing the second position. This would lead to a Macron-Le Pen second-round runoff on April the 24th. Le Pen has steadied her ship in the final leg of the presidential campaign by broadening the lead over her far-right rival, Zemmour. Le Pen's primary focus is the elusive vote populaire, that is the working-class electorate. It was once solidly left-wing, but has since drifted to the far right over the years. Le Pen's far-right candidate, Eric Zemmour, has been vocal about his anti-Islamic position and harsh rhetoric towards migrants. Experts suggest that Zemmour's incendiary attacks on immigrants and Muslims have helped Le Pen gain those extra points. According to recent polls, Le Pen is the second most liked politician in the country currently, with 35% of the people saying that they have a good image of the leader. Le Pen, who has toned down her rhetoric to come across as more respectable during this campaign, is currently the key contender to President Emmanuel Macron. Recent polls have indicated Macron could win the election with nearly 53% of the vote, while Le Pen is likely to end up with 47% of the vote. Well, our correspondent Ross Cullen is joining us live from Paris. Well, Ross, let's start with a rundown of how things are currently looking in this French election.
Well, Nick, yes, we are now just 9 days away from the first round. As you mentioned there, the French election is split into two rounds for this presidential vote. The first one is on the 10th of April. All 12 candidates will be able to stand. And then the top two candidates, if no one candidate does get a majority, the top two then go on to a runoff 2 weeks later to face off against each other in a straight battle for the presidency. And then on the 24th of April, that is when we are confirmed to who will be the next or the continuing President of France. Emmanuel Macron is eligible to run again. You can serve 2 5-year terms as President of France. He is coming to the end of his first term after storming to the presidency in 2017 as the surprise centrist option. He is running his campaign as much as he can do. Of course, he is also dealing with the war in Ukraine, but in terms of the domestic campaign, you're right that it seems that current polls do suggest that Marine Le Pen is his most likely opponent in the second round. The extreme right leader has led the National Rally, is the current iteration of her party. Previously, the National Front. She was the candidate who stood against Emmanuel Macron in that runoff 5 years ago. She could well be ending up in a rematch against him. Some of the other candidates include Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the far left leader of the France Unbowed party, and also on the right, you mentioned Marine Le Pen has a rival of her own on her wing of the political spectrum, Eric Zemmour, who is another far-right leader who has formed his own party to try to be able to take the presidency. There are also the more regular centre-right and centre-left parties that were pretty much taken aback seriously by Emmanuel Macron's win in 2017, but they are running far behind Valérie Pécresse and Anne Hidalgo for the Republicans and the Socialists. But the campaign is going on, and we are now heading in towards the period where parties will start to plan their final election rallies and big events. Emmanuel Macron has one coming up this weekend here in Paris. We are going to see more. Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc Mélenchon have some next week as well, as they try to show that they are the right person to lead France for the next 5 years. A crucial election, and now coming after the German election we had last year, the end of Angela Merkel's era as Chancellor of Germany. France is the only nuclear armed power inside the European Union. It's a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and as a major player on the world stage, as we've seen with the war in Ukraine. So it is a crucial election, not just for Europe, but for the wider world as well.
And Ross, you mentioned the war in Ukraine. Of course, what's happening in France is taking place with that backdrop of war in Eastern Europe. What kind of an impact is that war in Ukraine having on this election in France?
Well, Emmanuel Macron left it very late, Nick, to declare his candidacy, that he was going to stand for re-election. He was regularly holding calls with Joe Biden, Olaf Scholz, Boris Johnson to try to organise a coordinated Western response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That continues to dominate. He spoke to Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, in the last hour. We just had a tweet readout from the Ukrainian leader saying that continued talks with Emmanuel Macron about countering Russian aggression, discussing the negotiation process, and also the initiative of France for humanitarian corridors from Mariupol that Volodymyr Zelensky says must be implemented. That was an idea that France, along with Turkey and Greece, discussed about trying to organise evacuation processes from Mariupol, the besieged southern port city in Ukraine. So he was speaking to Volodymyr Zelensky just in the last couple of hours, the Ukrainian president, after late morning French time, having hosted 4 Ukrainian MPs and also a Ukrainian mayor who was captured by the Russian army on the 11th of March, held for 5 days in captivity before being involved in a prisoner swap. He was then released, and he has actually been speaking to Emmanuel Macron today to try to bring the point of view of Ukraine and Ukrainian MPs straight to the heart of the French government, straight into the French presidential office and residence, to speak to Emmanuel Macron directly in person. We are seeing also a visit to Kiev, the Ukrainian capital, today in person by the President of the European Parliament, Roberta Metsola, and we are now seeing in-person visits from Ukrainian officials here in Paris as well. So Emmanuel Macron is clearly involved regularly with the overall coordinated Western effort to try to continue to put pressure on Russia, to isolate Moscow, to force it to abandon its military invasion of Ukraine. Emmanuel Macron is trying to do as much as he can, he says, his team, when it comes to the diplomacy, but also not forgetting about the domestic election campaign. He is trying to show that he does have plans. He has unveiled his manifesto, but he is also trying to fight off scandal in the form of what's been known as McKinsey Gate, with the government spending more than $2 billion on services from the United States consultancy firm. It did admit to spending more than $900 million in 2021. It says it needed to do that to outsource some of the work to deal with the coronavirus pandemic here in France, but the reach of McKinsey inside the French government has gone beyond that, working also on pensions reform, on the digital transition, and the quite defensive reaction from the government about their use of McKinsey has caused a real problem for Emmanuel Macron in recent days. So the campaign is continuing, and Emmanuel Macron is trying to balance being able to work with Western allies, also speaking to Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking to Vladimir Putin also regularly as well, with trying to balance his domestic campaign. But he does have a fight on his hands from his closest rivals, which do appear to be coming from the far right.
Thank you very much, Ross. That was Ross Cullen joining us live from Paris. Well, next this morning, the United States has fanned out its top officials across the globe to press world leaders and pile up the pressure on Moscow. As the war enters its fifth week, the initial economic shock on Russia seems to be ebbing. The Deputy Treasury Secretary, Wally Adeyemo, held meetings with senior officials in London, Brussels and Paris, and will finish the week of diplomacy in Berlin. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken discussed the Ukraine war with Abu Dhabi Crown Prince Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan in Morocco, and the Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, Dileep Singh, was in India this week as the United States is considering its next economic steps to isolate the Russian president. These hectic diplomatic efforts come as the international impact of sanctions on Russian banks, oligarchs and companies begins to somewhat wear off. In over a month of sanctions, the ruble has largely recovered to its level that was just before the invasion. Shares on Russia's stock market are trading again. The Russian bank VTB remains open for business in Europe. It was a principal sanctions target. And other Russian banks are considering China's UnionPay credit card system after Visa and MasterCard suspended operations in Russia. And the sanctions so far have left Russia's biggest economic lifeline largely untouched. Energy sales to Europe could be up to over $500 million a day at current prices. Russia is demanding payments in rubles for gas, which could boost the economy further. So the Biden administration is making sure European allies are firmly aligned on punishing Putin, while working to sway leaders who've been sitting on the sidelines as the war stretches on. US President Joe Biden announced on Thursday that his government will release 1 million barrels of oil per day from the nation's strategic petroleum reserve over the next 6 months, as part of the Biden administration's efforts to keep the oil prices under control amid the raging war in Ukraine.
This is a moment of consequence and peril for the world, and pain at the pump for American families.
U.S. President Joe Biden on Thursday addressed rising gasoline prices, which have soared during Russia's war with Ukraine, by launching the largest release ever from the U.S. Emergency Oil Reserve.
Today, I'm authorizing the release of 1 million barrels per day for the next 6 months, over 180 million barrels. It will provide a historic amount of supply for a historic amount of time, a 6-month bridge to the fall.
The release of crude oil from the country's strategic petroleum reserve will more than cover oil exports to the U.S. from Russia, which Biden banned this month. The president also called on Congress to make oil companies pay a fee if they are sitting on thousands of unused oil and gas leases and wells on public lands.
I'm calling for a use it or lose it policy. This is the time, not the time to sit on record profits. It's time to step up for the good of your country.
Biden estimated that the release of U.S. oil reserves could push down gas prices anywhere from 10 cents to 35 cents per gallon, depending on how much allies and partners also release from their reserves. The announcement comes as part of a broad effort by Biden to tackle raging inflation that has hurt U.S. consumers and threatens Biden's fellow Democrats as they seek to maintain control of Congress in the November elections.
Ukrainian farmers in the western part of the country have begun sowing amid the raging war. Although the prospects of completing it successfully look bleak, the farmers are willing to take the risks and face challenges in the coming weeks.
Spring sowing has just begun across western Ukraine, but with war raging in the country, the prospects of completing it successfully look bleak for Ukrainian farmers like Taras Manzyuk. He owns a family farm near Lviv. He's facing a shortage of pesticides and herbicides, along with rising prices.
There was a significant increase in the cost of fertilizers, more than 100% on methods we use to protect our crops, because they are mainly pegged to the US dollar. Diesel fuel has increased in price by about 60% and has a huge influence on us.
Manzyuk farms wheat, soybeans, and other crops. He expects to make difficult decisions if things get worse in the coming weeks.
Of course, the current situation at home doesn't allow us to do our job properly, grow the wheat, feed our people, feed Europeans and the whole world. This isn't just our war and our problem.
Ukraine was the world's fourth largest grain exporter last year, International Grains Council data shows. And the crisis there comes as food prices around the world have already been spiking for months amid global supply chain problems. The UN said last week that world food prices hit a record high in February and have risen by over 24% in a year.
My main problem here is the lack of understanding of what will happen tomorrow. But everyone has this problem, and we have to struggle with this somehow and try to overcome it.
Ukraine's new agriculture minister said last week that global food prices would continue to rise if the situation in Ukraine does not change.
Next today, as Turkey seeks to mend its ties with Saudi Arabia, a Turkish prosecutor on Thursday urged authorities to halt and transfer Jamal Khashoggi's trial to Riyadh. According to reports, the prosecutor has asked an Istanbul court to halt the trial in absentia of 26 Saudi nationals over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The next hearing has been scheduled for April the 7th, where the Istanbul court will ask the Justice Ministry's opinion regarding the transfer of proceedings. Khashoggi's killing at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul 4 years back triggered a global outrage against Saudi de facto ruler Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Khashoggi, a harsh critic of the Saudi Crown Prince, was last seen entering the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October the 2nd, 2018. US and Turkish officials believe he was brutally strangled and then his body removed. A US intelligence report that was released a year ago said the prince had approved the operation to kill or capture Khashoggi, but the Saudi government has repeatedly denied any involvement. In 2020, the kingdom jailed 8 people over Khashoggi's murder. At the time, Turkey said the verdict was not enough and harsher punishment was needed. The latest change in Turkey's stance is a complete somersault of its stance regarding the Khashoggi trial. The killing and subsequent accusations soured ties between Ankara and Riyadh and led to an unofficial Saudi boycott on Turkish goods. This slashed Turkey's exports to the kingdom by nearly 90%. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has since tried to mend ties with Saudi to step up the bilateral trade and boost Turkey's failing economy. The political crisis in North Africa's Tunisia has intensified after the dissolution of the parliament, and President Kais Saied has ruled out elections for at least the next 3 months. The Tunisian president issued a decree on Wednesday dissolving the parliament. This was 8 months after he'd been suspended from Tunisia's Assembly of Representatives. Said's opponents accused him of a coup when he suspended the chamber last summer. He brushed aside most of the 2014 constitution and moved to rule by decree. Tunisia's 2014 constitution says the parliament must remain in session during any exceptional period. It also states that dissolving the chamber should trigger a new election, but he has not yet announced one. Following the dissolution, the Free Constitutional Party urged Said to call early elections. In an opposition party that is projected by polls to be the biggest party in the parliament if elections are held. But during a meeting with the country's prime minister, the president refused to hold an election anytime soon. Tunisia's main opposition party rejected Said's move to dissolve parliament. The party said it will boycott any referendum that he calls to restructure the political system unilaterally. Washington, meanwhile, said that it is deeply concerned by the decision of the Tunisian president to dissolve parliament, and it called for a rapid return to constitutional government. The Speaker of Tunisia's parliament, Rachid Ghannouchi, also rejected Said's dissolution of the assembly. Ghannouchi said he considered the parliament to still be in operation and that the president does not have the constitutional right to dissolve parliament.
الرئيس ليس من حقه الدستوري أن يحل البرلمان التونسي لا يمكن حله إطلاقا بشكل مطلق إلا في حالة واحدة عندما يعجز للمرة الثانية عن إنتاج حكومة، عن تزكية الحكومة، وإلا ما ثمش صورة أخرى من تجيز حل البرلمان. فقرار الرئيس قرار باطل لأنه مخالف لصريح الدستور.
This Sunday, Hungary's nearly 8 million voters will elect 199 members of the country's National Assembly. Now, Viktor Orban's ambitions hang in the balance as his close relationship with Vladimir Putin comes under the spotlight.
Viktor Orban's dream of an unbroken two-decade spell ruling Hungary hangs in the balance in Sunday's election, with his close relations with Vladimir Putin under the spotlight. Polls suggest 6 opposition parties, united against him for the first time, are within striking distance of unseating his nationalist Fidesz party. He now acknowledges the election won't be a walkover. Orban responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine by posing on billboards as the Hungarian people's protector. He accuses opposition politicians of trying to drag Hungary into the war, a charge they've denied. Earlier this month, he told supporters the Ukraine crisis had raised the election stakes to the sky, with a choice between, quote, the pro-peace right or the pro-war left, construction or destruction.
Építkezés vagy rombolás.
Tibor Zsavex, who heads the Zsavex research think tank, said foreign policy has shot up the agenda.
The
nature of the campaign is totally different. I am not saying that local problems in constituencies have disappeared, but national politics and the relationship to the war, the aggression with Putin, with the decisions of the EU and NATO have become more important than local issues.
Való kapcsolódás, ezek fontosabb témákká váltak, mint a helyi ügyek.
Opposition leader Peter Márki-Zay has seized the opportunity, telling voters they face a choice between the West and the East, criticising Orban's closeness to Putin and what he said is an erosion of democratic rights. Fidesz swept elections in 2018 on a fierce anti-immigration campaign that earned Orban praise from former US President Donald Trump and Europe's far right, and set him on a collision course with Brussels. Orban has transformed Hungary into a self-styled illiberal democracy, with a firm grip over media and loyalists in charge of top institutions. Opinion polls still give Fidesz a narrow lead to win a 4th term, but with about a fifth of Hungary's 8 million voters still undecided, Sunday's vote could go either way.
Well, moving on, you may have heard of pleather or patent leather, touted as an alternative to leather. This material is essentially made of plastic, though, making it an unfit and unsustainable option for consumers looking for cruelty-free and environmentally friendly materials. We leave you with this story. Thanks for watching.
If you're someone who has been on the quest for a vegan alternative for leather, it may have been disheartening to see patent leather and pleather being sold as the next best alternative. Though these are a cruelty-free alternative, they are essentially plastic, which is often not very durable. And besides, not the best for the environment. They are an alternative and just that. But here's what you need to know, that the technology to produce vegan and plastic-free alternatives for leather does exist.
You see here a bunch of different versions of reishi, all of which use our fine mycelium technology. And fine mycelium is our patented way of growing the mycelium into this really dense, strong structure. It's also really versatile. We can tune the properties as it grows to create different types of reishis that have functionality even beyond that of leather today.
This is reishi, a material made by harnessing the power of mycelium, which is the root-like part of fungi. And once processed, reishi takes on the tone and texture of leather. So what you're looking at is essential mushroom leather. The size, color, texture and thickness of mycelium can be adjusted to create luxury leather goods. In fact, a biotech company in California has already tied up with brands such as Hermes to start production. This material can be used to produce a range of goods. Like reishi, there are a host of other plant-based natural leathers that are being tested and which may soon appear on the shelves in some of the more popular brands.
What are all these sort of? There are many other. This is right, Arab.